What's up guys, 30IR here, bringing you 4K gaming and beyond. This is true 4K and 5K gaming, none of that upscale DSR super sampling bullshit. I wanted to bring you guys a video about the new GTX TITAN X Pascal. It was just released yesterday, August 2nd, and I ordered 4 of them, and I just got them this morning, and I've been benchmarking them throughout the day off and on, and I wanted to bring you guys a preliminary video of some benchmarks that I ran both in 4K and in 5K. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So the benchmarks for the GTX TITAN X Pascal for a single card running in 4K UHD, which is 3840 by 2160, are quite varied. So the settings are, I overclocked them to about 2050 megahertz, which was like an additional, I think, 225 in MSI Afterburner. And the amazing thing was, for this card, the memory, I was able to overclock it to an additional 825 megahertz. So the speed of the memory was about 5832, or in actuality that's about 11,664 megahertz. And the CPU that I'm running is the i7-6950X at 4.3 gigahertz. And so that's the setting. I set all the games to, or the resolution to 4K UHD, as I said. So as you can see, let's start with Doom running the Vulkan API. Now this is something that I've actually had an issue with before when I was running the 1080s as well. I don't know of a way to unlock the frame rate for this game. It sounds kind of stupid, but I know for sure VSync is not on. But regardless of that, the FPS is capped at 64 and it just stays there. So it's really weird. It did dip a couple of times, but you know, the minimum frame rate actually was just 62, so it was like literally around 63, 64 FPS the whole time. But I'm pretty sure it can go above that if the frame rate was unlocked. But regardless of that, I had all the settings maxed out in nightmare mode, and also running, I believe, AA as well in this case. The TS AA, I believe, at 8x. And I was still able to get around 63 frames per second for Doom, which is amazing on a single card. So there we have it. On a single GPU, I was able to get more than 60 frames at 4K. Now going on to the next game, The Witcher 3, I was playing the Blood and Wine DLC, and this game was also interesting. The average was around 50 frames a second, but I saw up to 58, and the lowest was about 47. And all these benchmarks were run using Fraps, using the benchmarking tool. So it runs for 60 seconds straight, and I run it like 2 or 3 times, and I average the scores. So that's how I got these scores. So this is the average of 3 runs of the benchmarks in each game. So The Witcher 3 was averaging about 50 FPS, again maxed out, all Hairworks turned on, all the other GameWorks settings on, and including I believe 8 times AA for the Hairworks, and running AA in the game as well. So at 4K UHD, The Witcher 3 gives about 50 FPS with a single TITAN X Pascal, which is amazing. The really, the far outlier here is the results for Battlefield 4, which is one of my favorite games. I play it a lot. I can't wait for Battlefield 1. But regardless of that, with one GTX TITAN X Pascal overclocked and running a 6950X CPU overclocked, at 4K the performance is just bonkers. Like as you can see in the graph here, the maximum frame rate was 170 FPS, and the minimum was 101, and I was averaging about 140. And this is with every setting turned on to ultra. I was not running any AA, but I was running every other setting maxed out, and it was just, I mean, just incredible performance. To think that such a demanding game, and this was on a 64-player public server, so you know, it was pretty intense action, but the performance was just amazing. So imagine when Dell comes out with their 4K OLED 120 hertz monitor, games like Battlefield 4 will have no problems running at that frame rate with a single GPU. Just think about that. That's just phenomenal. Moving on to the next game is one of my favorite, which is Mirror's Edge Catalyst. I just got it recently. You guys would have seen the video that I did using two GTX 1080s, and in 5K I showed you that the performance was just horrible, but anyway, I'll get to that later. Using the GTX TITAN X Pascal, running this game in 4K UHD, as you can see in the graph, I was averaging about 57 FPS, maxed out at about 72, and you know, dropped to about 48 at times. So overall not bad. It's still close to 60 FPS. The magic number here is 60. If we can maintain around 60 FPS or more average, then it's a great performing game, and you know, the single card can basically handle 4K without issue. Okay, so moving on, Project Cars is probably the most amazing racing game out there. Of course, a lot of you might disagree with that, but I just love it. The graphics, the cars, everything is just phenomenal about it. And the performance, to top it off, is also amazing. So with one card running in 4K with everything maxed out, including I believe 2 times AA, I was maxing out about 150 frames a second, and it dropped to about 105, but I was still averaging over 125 frames a second, which is just supremely good performance. Now, Shadow of Mordor is a great action-adventure game that came out a few years ago, but it's still really demanding in terms of performance. So this is with the HD, or I believe the Ultra textures installed, and every setting maxed out. I don't think I was using, oh no, actually I'm sorry, I was using AA. I think they have a weird AA setting. It's like FXAA plus something, I forget the name of it, but it's like the max setting for AA that was available in game, and I was using that, and at 4K using a single GTX TITAN X Pascal, I was averaging over 50 frames a second, again, which is really good. It wasn't quite 60, but I was still averaging about 50, and you know, saw anywhere up to 69 frames a second, and then it dropped to about 46 at times when the combat was, you know, really intense, and there were many orcs or ogres or whatever they're called, uruks, my bad. I'm not too well versed in the Lord of the Rings mythology here, but anyway, the performance was pretty good. I did have an asterisk next to the game because in order to run 4K, it wasn't quite 4K UHD. The setting I ran was actually higher than that. It was 4096 by 2304, which is actual true 4K. It's even higher than cinematic 4K, which is 4096 by 2160. So even with the higher level of performance, or I mean, sorry, the resolution, I was still averaging 57 FPS. I'm sorry, 51 FPS. But I believe if the setting was at 3840 by 2160, we could have seen closer to 60 FPS on average for that game. Now, another favorite game of mine is Grand Theft Auto 5. I've yet to meet anyone who dislikes that game. If you guys know anyone who dislikes it, please slap them for me. But I don't take any responsibility for any repercussions for that, of course, just as a disclaimer. So, GTA 5, I'm running the R-Enhancer mod, which is, I believe, just like a light ENB slash a reshade preset, and all the settings are maxed out, you know, all the PCSS shadows, tessellation on very high, everything is maxed out, but running at 4K UHD with one GTX TITAN X Pascal, and the performance is just like ridiculous. I was averaging 114 FPS. Lowest was 97 and maximum was 167 FPS. Just think about that, guys. Like a game that's modded heavily with, you know, tons of car mods, texture mods, you know, etc., and running a really intense reshade preset, you know, maxed out at 4K UHD, is averaging 114 FPS with one GPU. This Titan X Pascal is just so incredible. I'm going to share my thoughts with you guys, you know, later on, but it's just my initial impressions are just like, it's amazing. I don't have words to explain how crazy this card is. So moving on. Now, a lot of people on the forums, you know, it's like a stupid meme that always crept up. Like, whenever you said, oh, I got this GPU, and like some retard will always post, can it play Crysis 3? Well, look, asshole, it actually plays Crysis 3. And when I say plays, I mean it plays Crysis 3. We're averaging about 64 FPS with every setting maxed out. SMAA is the only AA that I use in this game, but every other setting is on very high, or the maximum setting available. So 16x anisotropic filtering, etc. So we're averaging 64 FPS, minimum of 54, and maximum of 81. This is just phenomenal. So when somebody says, can it play, you know, blank game, what they mean is, can it hold around 60 FPS, right? So in this case, it does. With one GPU at 4K, Crysis 3 averages above 60 FPS. So finally we can say to anyone who says, can it play Crysis 3? Just show them this video. And it clearly proves that Crysis 3 can run at greater than 60 FPS maxed out. So the last game that I tested was Batman Arkham Knight, another fun little game. I stopped playing it for a while actually, but I got back into it a little bit because I believe they introduced some new like challenge maps that I didn't even know existed. So when I fired up the game today, I was like, holy shit, this is pretty cool. So I tested it using the challenge maps, not the story mode. But I think it, you know, the performance is still, like, it speaks for itself. So using a single GPU, playing at 4K UHD with every setting maxed out, including the GameWorks settings of like interactive I think interactive smoke and interactive something else. There were two GameWorks settings. They were turned on. Everything else was on the maximum setting. We're averaging 90 FPS. Like, that's just phenomenal performance. Minimum of 88, maximum of 91, but average is the most important metric here, and we were averaging 90 FPS in Batman Arkham Knight at 4K UHD with a single GTX TITAN X Pascal. So these are the games that I've tested so far. I'm going to be doing more videos, obviously, of testing the GTX TITAN X, not only one card, but in SLI, and then eventually 3-way and 4-way SLI. So let's now talk about the 5K performance using a single GTX TITAN X Pascal. Okay, so let's take a look at the 5K performance for a GTX TITAN X Pascal using a single GPU, also overclocked to 2050 megahertz and 5832 on the memory, and a 6950X CPU at 4.3 gigs. So going through the list again of the same games, we're comparing 4K and 5K here. It's actually pretty amazing. As I mentioned before, Doom was a little wonky in terms of the maximum FPS being capped to 64. I don't know why that was the case, but the interesting figure here is even at 5K with every setting maxed out in nightmare mode, I was averaging 60 FPS. Which is just like ridiculous. The two GTX 1080s, if you look at the GTX 1080 SLI benchmark video that I did, you'll see that the performance was nowhere near this. Of course, you know, Doom still can't use SLI, so I guess that kind of defeats the purpose, but I was getting around like 35 to 40 FPS on a single GTX 1080 in Doom, and now this is like 20 FPS more. So the Titan X Pascal is just an absolute monster. So The Witcher 3 suffered a lot at 5K. I mean, we're talking 14.7 million pixels, or 70% more pixels than 4K UHD. So at that resolution with everything maxed out, including hairworks and all the other settings, the average FPS was only around 33. But remember, this is with a single GTX TITAN X Pascal. So the max we saw was 36, minimum was actually slightly under 30, but the average was around 33. Now Battlefield 4 was no issue, but the interesting thing to keep in mind here is there's a huge variance between the max and min frame rates at 5K. And this was not the case in 4K, but nonetheless the performance was still pretty damn good. Averaging around 73 FPS, maximum way out there at 122, but the min at 55. So keep in mind, when you play games, you don't want the variance of frame rate to be too high, because when that happens, you're going to get like a jittery experience. You want to keep the delta between the max and min as small as possible, so that your average is around the same and your gameplay experience is much more smooth. So having said that, it was not a problem because the average was still over 70 FPS, and at 5K a single GPU just demolished the game. Mirror's Edge Catalyst, now this just cracks me up, guys. I want you to go back and look at the video that I just released a week or 10 days ago on Mirror's Edge Catalyst in 5K using two GTX 1080 Founders Editions, overclocked to about 2088 megahertz, and the memory was around like 5500 and something like that, 5538 I believe. That video clearly shows that the performance was around 20 FPS at 5K with two GTX 1080s. With one GTX TITAN X Pascal, the performance in Mirror's Edge Catalyst is just ridiculous. The average is 33 FPS, max is 45, min is 28. It performs way better. It's totally playable at this frame rate. At 20 FPS, even with two 1080s, the game was literally unplayable at 5K. I ended up playing most of the game in 4K UHD, but in this case, even at 5K, it's playable with one card. So it's just, I can't wait to test this game in SLI using the TITAN X Pascals with the HP SLI bridge, I might add. So the average is 33 FPS, again with every setting maxed out. I think it's called hyper in this game, like all the settings are just maxed out and giving a great performance for this single card. Now the interesting thing is I'll be posting some wallpapers on 30ir.com for this game and everything else also, and you'll notice that in some of the 5K screenshots that I've taken, the VRAM usage was like literally at 12 gigs. It used the maximum available VRAM on the GTX TITAN X Pascal, which is just phenomenal. So maybe I'm wondering whether the VRAM was actually a limiting factor at 5K for the GTX 1080s. So that would be interesting to find out. If the 1080s had 12 gigs of VRAM, would it have performed better than a single TITAN X? I'm not so sure, but as far as these numbers go, a single TITAN X Pascal performs way better than two 1080s in this game, which is saying a lot actually. So moving on to Project Cars, again one of my favorite racing games. Performance was not an issue at 5K with a single card, looking at averaging 93 FPS and maxing out over 100 FPS, and the minimum's only 80. So since I'm running 5K at 60 hertz, like there was literally no problems with the gameplay. Everything was just buttery smooth. Cars sounds amazing, and everything was just cool. Like, you want to maintain over 60 FPS, and this game was just no problem with a single GPU. Now Shadow of Mordor, as I said before, is a really demanding game, and at 5K that just increases it exponentially. So having said that, with a single card it's still playable because I was averaging around 34 FPS and maxed out at about 44, and the min was slightly under 30 again. But at 34 FPS, a game like Shadow of Mordor, where the textures are really high quality, all the effects are just insanely powerful, to average around 34 is pretty damn good for a single card. That brings me to the trio in GTA 5, one of the best games ever made in my opinion, with all the mods and stuff. It just looks so sick. But this literally, like, when I created this graph and I did the benchmark for this game, I I just had to stop playing for a while and just stare at the screen. It was just like mind-boggling to me. Let me explain what I mean by that. Just a few months ago, I had the GTX TITAN X Maxwell editions, 4 of them in 4-way SLI, playing the same game at the same settings. Although I had the 5960X, which was an octa-core CPU, overclocked to about 4.4 gigahertz, whereas now I have the 10-core CPU, the 6950X at 4.3. All other things being the same, maxed out settings at 5K. I didn't get the same performance I did with 4 GTX TITAN X Maxwells in GTA 5 as I am getting with a single GTX TITAN X Pascal. Let's just step back for a moment. I know the GTX TITAN X is a shit ton of money for many people. $1,200 for a graphics card is a lot of money. I don't care who it is. Even for me, it's a lot of money. For everybody, it's a lot of money. Okay, and if you're paying $4,000 or more for GPUs and you're getting, let's say, around averaging 60 FPS, and you guys can go back and look at the older videos of GTA 5 that I did, and I clearly show the performance metrics on the top left. Many times during the game, it dips to like 55, maybe even 50 FPS, and maxes out around 70, maybe 75 in certain areas. But I was averaging around 60 FPS in 5K with 4 GTX TITAN X Maxwells. But with this GPU, the Pascal TITAN X, with one card, I'm averaging 78 FPS, maxing out 83, and the minimum didn't go below 70. Like, that's just, I don't know, I'm having like what do you call it, an egasm here. Like, this is just amazing. Like, I have never experienced such a euphoria before in my life. Like, $1,200 compared to like $4,400, how much ever I think I got the superclocked editions of the Maxwell TITAN X's, and it was like $4,400. That doesn't perform as well as something that costs $1,200. You know where the value is. But it's just like, it's mind-boggling to me how well this one card performs at such a high resolution. It's truly phenomenal what they've done with this card. I can't rave enough about it, and I'm not even tested SLI yet. I can't wait to share with you guys the numbers for SLI. And you know, unfortunately, like, NVIDIA is not enabling 3-way and 4-way SLI for this card, and also the 1080s. So I'm gonna just put 2 of them in the Uber rig and then 2 of them in the other rig, the ROG Swift rig that I have. So unfortunately, but otherwise I would have run 4-way SLI on the Uber rig and just pretty much crushed everything out there. But anyway, you know, as far as this is concerned, the gameplay, this is just phenomenal. On a single GTX TITAN X Pascal at 5K with every setting maxed out, I'm averaging 78 FPS in GTA 5, which is such a complex game with, you know, so many mods I have installed, and like the reshade preset and the suite effects and all this other shit in there, and it performs so well, and it's just like an amazing experience. So I just, like, I really want to show the star of this whole thing, I believe, is GTA 5 and how well it performs. And as I said before, when you compare the graphs to Battlefield 4 and GTA 5, you can see how the variance between the min and max is much lower. It's only 12 FPS, whereas the variance between min and max in Battlefield 4 is about 67, if my math is right. So that's a huge difference, whereas in GTA 5 it's just 12, and the average is about 78, which is phenomenal. So anyway, enough splooging about GTA 5. Let's move on to Crysis 3. Playing this at 5K maxed out. I still remember I tried this with 4 TITAN X Maxwells, and I was not getting, you know, that great performance by any means. It was around 40 or 50 FPS. But here, with one card at 5K, the minimum was only 30, the max was around 50 or 49, and I was averaging about 40, which is a totally playable frame rate. Yeah, it would have been nice to get more, but at 5K, Crysis 3, which is so demanding, is still one of the best looking games ever made. Still performs so well. It's really a treat. And then last but not least, Batman Arkham Knight. Fun little game at 5K, averaging over 60 FPS with all the settings maxed out, including the NVIDIA GameWorks settings. And the variance was a little bit high, about 18 FPS, but it wasn't too bad. The important thing was that the average was still above 60 FPS at 5K. So, as you guys can see, one GTX TITAN X Pascal performs better than anything that has come before. I don't care what anybody has said. I've had 4 GPUs of every generation since GTX 580 classified, and this card blows everything out of the water. Like, it's phenomenal. It looks incredible. It's got such a sexy enclosure, the black enclosure with the design that they've done. It's got that blower type cooler, which is fine. You know, as far as the temperature is concerned, I was seeing maximum of around 72, 73 degrees Celsius, you know, with the fan on auto. Of course, I have an aggressive profile set, but nonetheless, you know, the temperature was not a problem at all. Memory overclocks phenomenally well, as you can see in the title I've listed. It's around 11,664 megahertz, which is super fast. It has 12 gigs of VRAM, and you know, it performs amazingly well. A lot of people were disappointed at first when they announced this card that first they called it just a Titan X, which sounds exactly the same as the previous generation, and 2, it didn't have the HBM memory, and it was supposed to have 16 gigs of VRAM, but it has only 12. So people were wondering, is this like a gimped version of the new Titan X, or is this what the 1080 Ti was supposed to be like? But we don't know those things. As far as we know in the public domain, this card is really the king of the hill, and that's not just some marketing bullshit. It actually like beats the shit out of every card out there, and I would dare to say that it outperforms most cards out there, even in SLI, as I've proven to you today. So having said that, now let's take a look at the 4K and 5K results side by side. Alright, so let's compare the 4K and 5K benchmarks for a single GTX TITAN X Pascal running at 2050 megahertz and the memory overclocked to 5832 or 11664 megahertz, and a 6950X at 4.3 gigs. So the graph shows the gray bars are 5K and the orange bars are 4K UHD, and this is just comparing a few of the games that I benchmarked. So starting off with Doom, we can clearly see that 4K has a slight edge. Again, I think this particular benchmark for Doom is not the greatest because I was capped at 64 FPS for both resolutions, so I know that that's off. I'm sure 4K performs a lot better, but these are the average numbers for the games in both resolutions. So in 5K it was averaging about 60 FPS, and in 4K it was averaging about 63 in Doom, with everything maxed out and using the Vulkan API. With the Witcher 3 Blood and Wine DLC, the difference is quite stark. So with 4K UHD I was averaging about 50 FPS, whereas in 5K, because of the huge increase in resolution, or 70% more pixels, the average was only around 33 FPS. But remember guys, this is just using one GPU. So going to Battlefield 4, again the difference is pretty phenomenal. It's actually almost double, or I should say the reverse. It's actually half the performance compared to 4K and 5K. So I was averaging 140 FPS in 4K UHD, but in 5K I was averaging only around 73, which is not bad at all, but just look at how big the difference is there. Now Mirror's Edge Catalyst, again this is quite interesting. With it's a really recent game with incredible graphics done by DICE. It's a really demanding game as well. So in 4K UHD, it was close to 60 FPS on average, but it was around 57. But then in 5K, it gets hammered quite a bit, and it was averaging around 33, which is still playable, but it's not the greatest FPS. Project Cars, on the other hand, of course, averaging over 125 FPS in 4K, but in 5K it drops to around 93, which is still great. We're looking for, again, to keep in mind, or keep perspective, we want the golden number is 60. So if you can maintain an average of 60 FPS, that's exactly what we're looking for. So anything above that is just like icing on the cake. So Project Cars, both resolutions, a single GTX TITAN X Pascal shines, no problems at all. Shadow of Mordor, on the other hand, gets hammered a lot because it's such a demanding game. Little over 50 FPS in 4K, but around 34 FPS in 5K. Still, again, it's pretty playable, but it's not the greatest FPS. Now, the thing that I'm coming back to again is just how incredible GTA 5 performs, which is heavily modified on my system. And I have a ton of car mods and texture mods and whatnot. But 4K UHD, well over 100 FPS, actually around 114. But in 5K, it was still averaging 78 FPS, which is just supremely amazing and phenomenal. Crysis 3, again, pretty much the benchmark, from like 2,000 years ago when people asked, cavemen, hey, does Crysis, does your Coliseum run Crysis? No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, can it run Crysis has been a meme that's been around for probably 10 years or more now. But Crysis 3 has pretty much set the benchmark. It's an older game now, but it's still really, really demanding. And at 4K, it does over 60 FPS, which is crazy for one card. And then at 5K, it gets hammered quite a bit and drops around 40 FPS, which is not bad. But going to Batman Arkham Knight, again, a great performing game, great looking game. At 4K, no issues whatsoever, maxed out settings, 90 FPS on average. But in 5K, it's still over 60 FPS, which is what we're looking for. It's just a great performing card. So to kind of summarize what I've done here is benchmarking a new graphics card that was released yesterday. Pretty much didn't know anything about it. No reviews were out. I didn't have any preconceived notions on whether it was going to be great or whether it was going to suck or whether it was just going to be like a money drain where it's just like the coolest thing to get but doesn't really perform well. This is not that kind of card. This thing really lives up to its name, the Ultimate. Although it sounds cheesy, the GTX TITAN X Pascal is the best performing graphics card out there today. I have tested dozens upon dozens of cards, all on the NVIDIA side, of course. I have not really worked with AMD cards or done Radeon since 2006, but when I started building computers back in 2009, I've been solely running NVIDIA cards, and I've tested 4-way SLI since GTX 580 classifieds, and nothing has performed so well as this GTX TITAN X Pascal. There's something unique about this Pascal architecture, the way they've put it together. I don't know enough about the engineering behind it, but it's just the end result is it gives amazing performance, pretty much kills everything out there at 4K. There are a couple of games where it doesn't quite hit that 60 FPS, which is what like the golden number is, but nonetheless, most of the games are well over 60 FPS on average. Some of them are close enough, but if you're thinking, hey, can I get a single card that can run 4K well, and you have to be a little flexible. You can't say, oh, it has to be 60 FPS or bust, but if it's around 60 FPS, maybe a little less than that, that's running it pretty well in my opinion. And I've been gaming for a long time, so I can tell you that straight up. So if you ask yourself, hey, is there a single card that can run 4K well, this is it. The GTX TITAN X Pascal kills everything out there. The amount of VRAM, the 12 gigs of VRAM available, how well it overclocks. It easily overclocked to 2000, above 2000 megahertz, and the memory clocks fantastically well. Of course, you need a pretty good CPU, but you don't need the 6950X. That's more for like multitasking. If you get one of the cheaper 6700K and overclock it pretty well, that should perform really well for gaming. But yeah, if you were considering a new build, guys, and you want the best performing graphics card, the Titan X Pascal is the one to get. I will be doing more benchmarks in SLI using the HP Bridge soon, so make sure you guys stay tuned for that. Make sure you share this video, tell your friends about it, show them the graph, and show people that finally Crysis 3 can be played maxed out in 4K at over 60 FPS using a single GPU. This has never happened before. And as I said, with GTA 5, when I was running 4 Titan X Maxwell cards at 5K, I was getting around 60 FPS. Whereas with this card, just one of them at 5K, I'm averaging around 78 or close to 80 FPS. The comparison is almost non-existent because it's so amazingly powerful and performs so amazingly well that this card is just like, it's really like kryptonite as far as I'm concerned. I mean, this is the card to get. My only gripe I could honestly say is not really the card, but the way that NVIDIA has gimped the SLI setups. I really want to be able to choose that for myself. If they said that you know, you guys can run 1 card or 4 cards, it's up to you, like they've been doing for years, you know, I have the freedom to choose how many cards I want to get and how many cards I want to use. And knowing me, I always get 4 cards because that's what I want to run. And I got 4 GTX TITAN X Pascals, but I can't run them except for a benchmark or 2, and I can't even run those now because 4-way SLI is not even possible in the control panel until the next driver update, according to a rep from NVIDIA. So you know, I didn't buy 4 cards just to run benchmarks. I'm gonna put 2 of them in each of my rigs and just have a lot of fun with it. But to recap, this card performs just unlike any other card out there. It just handles everything you throw at it, all the settings maxed out in a variety of games, a variety of genres of games, and it's just a great card to have in your system if you're ever ambivalent about getting, oh, should I go with like a 1080 SLI setup or should I go with the Titan X Pascal. Having owned both, I can tell you hands down that although a GTX 1080 SLI setup is around the same price, I guess, right? It's $599 for the 1080s, and the Pascal Titan X is about $1,200. But I guarantee you that if you run a single card that performs just as well or slightly better, that's the way to go. So there's no comparison really. Like, the GTX Titan X is the king of the hill. Make sure you guys subscribe, hit that like button, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Share this video to everybody you know. Thank you for watching.